And as you can see from our title, Anti-Semitism, a sign of Christ's return. Now, what the heck is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism, of course, is hostility or prejudice against the Jew. And that, as our chairman has pointed out, has been on the increase for quite some time. If we go back to 2002, here's the headlines, front page of one of our major papers, the Time magazine, and what it says is that anti-Semitism is on the march again. And my word, it is, and particularly right now. Okay, that's 2002, but look now. Here we are, 2017, and here's one of the British papers, The Independent. Anti-Semitic attacks hit record high in OK amid warnings over the rise of hatred and anger. And look at the numbers they're saying. The Community Security Trust, who keeps records of this, said it hit an all-time high with 767 incidents in the first 6 months of this year. That's staggering. That's the highest since records have been kept, they say. The highest since records have been kept. Staggering. It's growing. And here we come to Britain. Here's the leader of the opposition. British top Jewish writers slammed Jeremy Corbyn for tolerating Labour's anti-Semitism. And they claim that it's part of the Labor Party. Part of their policies almost. So things are changing dramatically. And of course with that has resulted in the Aliyah taking place. More Jews returning to the land of Israel. Here we've got a graph showing that. Last figure is 2015, I'm sorry, but it is indeed climbing. Climbing dramatically. 7,000 people left 2014 above numbers. Nearly 4 times the number of Jews who made the Aliyah in 2012, and it's continuing to climb. They're saying, look, if you were living in Europe, would you be very happy to have outside the school an army? Army representatives with their machine guns to protect your Jewish children in your Jewish school? And so little wonder, Exodus is underway. Jews are returning back to that land in ever increasing numbers. So that's very intriguing. But let's come back now. Let's come back and think a little bit more about it. I want to take us back to some words of a man by the name of Mark Twain. You may have heard of him. But he was quite a prolific writer, and he stated, the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Persians rose, filling the planet with sound and splendour, but passed away. And we'll look at that in a minute. The Greeks and the Romans followed. The Jews saw them all, beat them all. All things are mortal but the Jews. In other words, all of those powers are gone. But Israel remains and the Jew remains. All other forces passes, but he remains. What is the secret of its immortality? Of course, it's not truly immortal, is it? But what it's saying is, as a nation or as a people, they've never passed away. They've never gone out of existence. Others might have, but not them. So let's come back in history. Let's go back to the time of the Assyrians. The Assyrians invaded into the area of Israel and cruelly took many of them captive. Destroyed that nation to some degree. Took it into captivity into the area of Assyria. But the thing is, yes, they did that, but where's the Assyrian today? Remember what Mark Twain said? Where are they today? Gone. But the Jews still exist. Have a look at this. The Babylonians came down on Israel. 600 BC, approximately. It took Israel and Judah captive. But where are the Babylonians today? The Jews are still in existence. The Jews are still there. Hence the idea that they are immortal, not that they literally are, but as a nation and as a people, they continue to exist down through time. So if we can take all the empires represented in Daniel's image for a moment, of course, all of them have conquered the land, all of them have oppressed the Jew. But where are these empires today? But the Jewish people, it still exists in existence, and now it's a nation again. So the burning question for all of us is why? Why is this so? Well, let's come back and look at the question for a moment. Maybe we can tell it in another man's mouth. We know who this chap is, Churchill. Some people liked the Jews. He did. He claimed he was a Zionist at one point. And some do not. But no thoughtful man can deny the fact that they are, beyond any question, the most formidable and most remarkable race which has appeared on the earth. Why? Well, we'll answer that somewhat tonight. Why? That's the burning question that we need to really answer, because it's got lessons for us that can help us, that we might find a place in the kingdom shortly to be established. Now here's a young girl who stated that. There she is, Anne Frank. She gave really, in one of her writings, what the real truth of it is. It is God that hath made us as we are, but it will be God too who will raise us up again. And so indeed is happening now as a nation. So let's come back to the very beginning of those things. And if you come with me back to Genesis chapter 12, where really the nation came into existence through Abraham. Abraham was a man that lived in Ur the Chaldees, there at the headwaters of the Persian Gulf. Now that Gulf somewhat retreated, so it's no longer a port, but there it is, Ur the Chaldees, been excavated today. And while he was dwelling there in that particular area, God approached him. And we read of the blessings that were offered to him in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord has said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And listen, I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. They are monumental words. Look at what he said to him. He said, now listen, you get out of here, you come with me, you go to the land I wish to show you. And he says, if you do that, get out of this land, come to where I say, I'll make of thee a great nation. You will never perish as a nation's concerned. Remember Mark Twain. Remember Churchill. That's indeed true. And then he added these words, which we just read a few moments ago. And I will make of thee a great nation. So the Jews would be a great nation. Yes, they would come into existence and depart as a nation down through time. But ultimately, they will be a great nation. And then he goes on to say, and I will bless thee and make thy name great. And he's talking particularly of Abraham. He said, Abraham's example would be followed by all of those who are faithful. And they would be therefore consequently blessed by the great God of heaven. And then in verse 3, and in thee shall all families of the earth ultimately be blessed. So through his descendant, the Lord Jesus Christ, a Jew, the world would be ruled and it would ultimately be blessed. So what an amazing promise that was made to him. So what did Abraham do? Of course, as we well know, there he is. He departed. He got out of Ur. He left that area. He went up into the area of Haran and then down into the land of Israel. Now, we've got Genesis 12 before us. Look at verse 6. Got it on the PowerPoint there, but it's before us, so we might as well read it. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. So they've entered into the land of Palestine, the land of Israel as we call it today. And then we read, and the Lord appeared unto Abram and said unto him, unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. So you see, he had obeyed. He had done what God had said. And so God said, yes, this land is going to be your land. And that land was defined in more detail in the next chapter. Look at chapter 13, verse 14. And there we read, and we'll read from the King James because I've got it in front of me. And the Lord said unto Abraham, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make of thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shalt thy seed be also numbered. So he defined the territory that would be given. He said, look, northward, southward, eastward, westward. That land is going to be your land. And so he promised that land, all that land, to Israel forever, ultimately. What a wonderful promise. But notice, particularly, look at verse 15 for a moment. Because this really has a lesson for us, and it's very valuable for us to know. He says, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. Now, who was he talking about there? Well, I'd like you to come with me to the New Testament. Come with me to Galatians chapter 3. Because this helps us to understand it. We may keep our hand there if you want to cross-reference it, because for a moment we're going to be quoting from there. But in Galatians chapter 3, so Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 19. Now, what's he talking about there? Sorry, verse 16. Who's he talking about? Chapter 3, verse 16. Now, to Abraham and to his seed were the promises made. Now, that's what we just read about, isn't it? Okay. And he saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. So the promise was made to Abraham and to his seed, singular. And that was Jesus Christ. Now that's wonderful. Now you would not get that if you didn't really have Paul explaining that to us. But now look at Galatians chapter 3, verse 27. It expands on that. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. You are neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you be Christ, now listen to this, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So yes, the promise was made to Abraham and to Jesus Christ. But not only to Jesus Christ, for those who were baptized into Jesus Christ, it was made to them. That can be us. And so that promise is a wonderful promise. But let's put that aside for the moment. We'll come back to that a little later. Now let's come back to the history of Israel. Well, what was happened to the Jews down through time? Well, we saw many oppressors conquered them. But ultimately, they were scattered. Jesus Christ predicted that himself. We won't turn it up. But in Luke chapter 21, verse 24, the Lord said, they, the Jews, shall fall by the edge of the sword. They shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Store that for a moment. Now, they will be trodden down. Well, what happened was they rebelled much against the Roman oppressors. And the Romans sent their general Vespasian, later on his son Titus, into the area of Israel in AD 60, about 67, through to AD 73. And they conquered that area. They destroyed it. Jerusalem was taken captive AD 70. And here's drawings of it. Remember the words of the Lord? And then they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. There's the fall of Jerusalem. And so that took place. They were sent into all nations. In Rome, you can go there today. And you go to Titus's arch. Remember, he was one of the generals. And on the sides of Titus's arch, there you can see them carrying the 7-branch candlestick into Rome, taken captive, taken away as a treasure. And here in the Colosseum, built by the slaves, Jewish slaves, built in Rome for the games. Yes, they were persecuted, they were cruelly dealt with, and they were scattered into all nations. They were scattered in all parts of the world, what became called the diaspora, the scattering. That's picking up the words of the Lord. And that's the name they give to Jews throughout the world up until more recent time. But even those areas, anti-Semitism was rife. They fled time and time again. We haven't time to look at all the dates, and I don't know all the details anyhow. But you can see the dates that took place. And after that, they were forced out of city after country out of country. They became called the Wandering Jews because they were forced out of nation, caused to flee because they refused to be converted to Christianity. But you see, it wasn't to remain that way. Now, this quote is worth turning up, I think. Jeremiah 31, wonderful verse in reference to this. Needs careful thinking about what's being said here, but it is worth looking at carefully. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 35. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for light by day, and the ordinance of the moon and the stars for light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. So he says, look, I cause the sun to rise. I cause the moon to move across the sky at night. I cause tides, you name it. All of those things happen. But then he goes on. If those ordinances depart from before me. So he says, if we can stop the sun rising, or we stop the moon in its path, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Now we know why they're called the immortal Jew. Because God will ensure that they exist. They will continue to exist. They will continue to exist forever. All right? An amazing thing. Now come with me one book over to Ezekiel chapter 37. And in Ezekiel chapter 37, we have a vision. It's hard to see it here, but it's meant to be a valley of dry bones, a morgue, so to speak, a cemetery, where the bodies all stand up, and it represents the nation of Israel. See, they went into captivity, didn't they? Under the Romans. It's as if they, as a nation, they were dead. But look how the chapter ends. Ezekiel sees those bodies coming to life again symbolically. So what's it all about? Well, look at verse 21. And say unto, we'll pick up with verse 20, and the sticks whereof thou writest shall be in thine hand before their eyes, and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land, upon the mountains of Israel. And one king shall be king to them all, and they shall be no more two nations. And neither shall they be divided into two kingdoms anymore. So, you know, they're amazing words. You imagine what Ezekiel thought as he saw those bodies symbolically standing up, representing the nation. He would have wondered what it meant, but it was explained so clearly to him. 4 points are made. Now, we're going to come back to this later, but there are the first 2 points. I'll gather them on every side and bring them into their own land. Now, you know, it's pretty obvious what's said there. And this is something that's stated repeatedly through the scriptures. So I guess it's not surprising. Way back in 1848, one of our early writers, a Dr. John Thomas, a medical doctor, he wrote in a book called Help Us Israel. There's the front cover of it. You can buy it tonight if you wanted it. It's in our library. There is then a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before his appearing. That's Christ's appearing. And their colonisation of Palestine will be on purely political principles. And they will return thither in unbelief of Jesus. And they will immigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders under the efficient protection of the British power. And so that's how we understood it from the scriptures. That's what he concluded. Remarkable. Because it's written well before Israel came into existence as a nation. Utterly remarkable. But indeed, that's exactly what happened. We won't turn this up just to save a little bit of time, but we'll come to it later. Jeremiah said in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 15, "And I will bring them again into that land I gave unto their fathers." See, that's saying the same as Ezekiel 37 we read a moment ago. "And I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after I'll send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of every holes of the rock." And it goes on to say, into that land. So first of all, he sent fishers. In other words, the Jews would be enticed back. Like, we catch fish, we put bait on the end of the hook, and hopefully the fish will catch it and come and be drawn in. That's indeed what initially took place. God's first action was to entice the Jews back to the land. But it began really with, still, anti-Semitism. We're going back into the 1890s. And in France at that time, in fact, I think even a little earlier than that, in France at that time, a Jew by the name of Dreyfus was in the army. And he was accused of sending secrets to the Germans. They accused him, and they're demoting him and taking him away as a captive. And then, because of false information, they sent him to an island that the French controlled, Devil's Island, and it was to be forever. But initially, he was sent out there for 5 years. There's where he was sent. There's drawings of it. And it was a horrible situation that he was in. But back in France, several of the newspaper men realised that that was not true. It was a trumped-up case. It was anti-Semitic driven. And so, this came out. Accused of selling military secrets, Dreyfus was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was convicted through poor evidence and anti-Semitism. French writers came to his defence, and he was eventually vindicated after many years. And here's one of the papers. Dreyfus, innocent. Innocent. Brought back into France. And many people no doubt felt a little ashamed of what took place. But it had a big influence on the newspaper writers. And one of those newspaper writers was this man, Theodor Herzl, a Jew. There's Dreyfus a little later on. He witnessed this case, could see that it was anti-Semitic. And what he did was, he was so moved deeply by it, being a Jew himself, he said, we've got to do something about it. And he wrote a book called The Judenstaat, The Jewish State. There it is, published 1896. And it had a deep impact on the Jews of Europe. And so consequently, in 1897, 1 year later on, they gathered on the borders of Switzerland and France at a place called Bâle. And they had a huge meeting where they talked about what's going to take place. And the spirit of that book was followed. They proposed the concept of a Jewish state. It's quite amazing what he said. He said, at the close of that, a Jewish state will be formed, if not now, within 50 years. And indeed, that was true. But you see, circumstances in Europe was chaotic at that time, utterly chaotic, and plunged into World War I. And one of the things that came out of World War I that affected the Jews was this. Lord Balfour, there he is, at the close, very much toward the close of the First World War, came out with what we call today the Balfour Declaration. And he proposed that the Jews be allowed to come back to the land of Israel. You know, it was quite remarkable. While he was proposing this in Britain, over in Israel, the Anzac forces were confronting the Turks and defeating them. Remarkably. Cavalry charges. In those days, even then, it was ridiculous to go forth with cavalry charges. But because of various circumstances, The Australian charge was accomplishing its purpose. Beersheba fell. Gaza Strip fell. And Jerusalem fell. And there we are. A few days later, after the Balfour Declaration was made in Britain, here is Allenby, the general, marching into Jerusalem. He got off his horse in respect for the city and brought his troops into that city of Jerusalem. But remember what that Balfour Declaration said. We're going to allow the Jews to have the land of Israel. That was the policy of those British leaders then, who were very religious. It did not remain. Remarkably, a window was given, an opportunity was given, and the consequences was that there in the land of Israel, the numbers of Jews began to increase. Opportunity was given just for a moment. But you see, the opposition still was there. And the Jews had to immigrate to the areas, often in decrepit old ships, endeavouring to get into the land. And there in that land they did exactly, don't know what's gone on there, but let's see if we can sort that out. Just bear with me for a moment. There it is. Don't know why that did that, but I'll have to, excuse me for a minute till I sort it out. We'll go through to slide sorter and then save ourselves a bit of time. If I can pick up where we were. There we are. Sorry about that. And that'll do. Right. It'll come. Just wait. There it is. So, we were back then. So then, now return with me to that Jeremiah one. I said we'd look at it again. Come with me to Jeremiah chapter 16. While that was underway, I should have asked you to turn it up, shouldn't I? But anyhow, there we are. I might have to ask some of the gurus at the back there if they can tell me why that crashed. I'm not entirely sure. But anyhow, if we come to Jeremiah chapter 16 and verse 15, there's what we read before, but look at it again. But the Lord saith, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from the land whither they be driven, I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. And the first method, behold, I'll send for many fishers. And of course, they were supported by Britain. They were supported by the Balfour Declaration in the early part, and they returned. They returned as farmers and shopkeepers and such like. But look what it goes on to say. He goes on to say, and I will, after, will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of the holes of the rocks. And the British turned their backs on Israel as time went by and opposed them. Even though the Jews were still returning, they allowed them to come, but they were relatively anti-Semitic in their oppression of the land at that stage. But things were much worse, and that was this. Hitler came to power. The end of the situation in Europe where there was a shortage of money, the depression. He came into power. They thought he was a great hero. Lots of factories were being opened, making weapons. But he rallied the people together often under anti-Semitism. Look at the banner. The Jew is our enemy. Women and matrons, the Jew is, and presumably that says the same, is our enemy. It's off the screen. Huge rallies. And the spirit of it was anti-Semitic. And we know what took place. The Second World War came. The cruel consequences. Anti-Semitism grew even worse and worse. The Holocaust, 6 million murdered. But with the defeat of Germany, things changed. Remember what Ezekiel said? They would come to that land, and come they did. And in increasing numbers, the Jews came into the land of Israel. And the modern miracle of Israel was born. Wow. Incredible. And remember what we saw before when we looked at Ezekiel 37? Remember the valley of dry bones rising? We looked at they will be gathered on every side and bring them in their own land. Right up to the close of World War II, That's indeed took place. But look what he says then. And I'll make them one nation in the land. So they were coming back. They took any opportunity, sometimes over-cramming ships. Britain sent naval ships out to sea to try and stop them, but they still came in. Ran their ships ashore on the coast of Tel Aviv or into the port of Haifa. And they came in huge numbers. And I might add, they're still doing the same today. But let's come back. Britain found it was getting out of control. They said, we're not going to look after this. We're just giving up. We'll give it up to the UN. Let's let the United Nations make their decision on it. And the vote was put. But before it was absolutely set, the Jews could see it wasn't going the right way. And they delayed the vote. And finally a friend of the President of the United States approached him, an old Jewish friend, and swung the vote in America. What do they need? They needed a 2/3 majority. That meant they had to get 31 votes. In the end, they got 33 out of 13. Just by the skin of their teeth, so to speak, it came into existence. Big surprise? Of course not. I'll make them one nation in the land. God had said that, and it was certain to take place. And so here we are, next year, 1948. I'll make them one nation, and here's the Prime Minister, Ben-Gurion, standing up. And because of fear, he's actually standing up in a museum inside Tel Aviv. Not in a prominent place, because they knew the Arabs could attack at any stage. Here was little Israel. What did their men have to defend themselves? Handguns. And so the Arabs attacked. 5 nations moved into that land. 5 nations with all their armies, with their tanks, with their aircraft. And they fought the Jews for 1 year and 1 month. And by the end of that, almost on every front they were defeated. Defeated by the Jews, remarkably, miraculously. No, we know why. God caused that to happen. And so they were victorious. And it's continued to be so, in spite of the anti-Semitism. There we are, 1947-48, the Arab attack. And again, problems in 1956. And again, they're victorious. And again, 1967. And again, they're victorious. Again, 1973. And again, they're victorious. Being attacked time and time again. When you check the facts out, they precipitated none of those wars. But let's take this one for just a few moments. You see, Israel knew what was coming. The leader of Egypt, here's Nasser. He made a speech. He says, we're going to blockade Sharm el-Sheikh. That was the headwaters of the Red Sea, the Red Sea where Israel got its oil. And they said, we'll blockade it, we'll cut off its oil, and they did. And Israel realised that they would not be able to get any oil for about 6 weeks, and they would have run out within about 4. They were left in a position they wouldn't have been able to do anything. And his aim? Well, look what he says. The annihilation of Israel. Anti-Semitism. So there in 1967, that was cut off. So no oil could get there. It was going to take 5 to 6 weeks for it to go all the way down and round through Gibraltar into Israel. Israel couldn't wait. And so here they were, threatened. 75,000 top soldiers, 400 of the latest tanks, 32,000 Jordanians, well trained, over 100,000 on its borders here, and Russia promising to come down, loading ships at that stage to come in. So put it together, 1/3 troops faced Israel. 2,300 tanks, most of them the most up-to-date you could get at that stage from Russia, and 700 combat aircraft. And Israel, it had mostly a civilian army of 120,000, outnumbered, using tanks that were built in World War II. Oh yes, re-gunned, but World War II. They were in a very desperate place. Very desperate. So what could they do? Israel had to survive. How did it survive? Well, the answer is very simple. We know it had an ally. It had a very powerful ally. Britain, America, Australia. It had God. The great God of heaven. And what did God say? Hear the word of Yahweh, O ye nations, and declare it in the isles afar off. And say, he that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. I'll care for them. And look, God is not a man that he should lie. Hath he said, shall he not do it? So what we are seeing is something that is certain, it's sure, it will never be broken. So there's Israel before. And here was the consequence. Afterward, 6 days later, 4 times bigger. Isn't that amazing? Well, not really, because God was with them. God was with them. And so the nation of Israel has grown in numbers. The numbers after the Second World War were great. Dropped away as the years rolled by, but as soon as the Iron Curtain came down, huge numbers came into the land. And so here they are there today. We're around about 7 million in the land of Israel today. But now, what does that tell us? Well, come with me to Ezekiel chapter 37 again. I want to look at the last of those steps that were spoken of in that chapter. So they would come back, there would be a nation. But then, let's pick up with verse 22. And I will make them one nation in the land. There they are. Upon the mountains of Israel, yes. And one king shall be king to them all. And they shall be no more 2 nations. So who's that king? Of course, as we well know, that king is the Lord Jesus Christ. Look, here's the last words of the Lord. Before he ascended into heaven. Or the angels at least, anyhow, as he ascended into heaven. Ye men of Galilee, said the angels, as he ascended up, why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as ye have seen him go into heaven. Of course he's got to. Who's going to rule jury? Christ. That's what we know. And so he must return. And that must be in the near future. We'll see why in a moment. And at that time, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst thereof. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem for battle, and the city shall be taken. So what are we being told? Yes, Christ will return. No shadow of a doubt about that. But before Christ returns, there must take place something very, very interesting. Maybe we could turn to Zechariah, second and last book of the Old Testament. Let's have a look at it. We're going to have a look at a few verses here. So what is he saying is going to happen? He says, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst thereof, and I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. So this is going to be the greatest anti-Semitic event ever seen. And the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Now look, then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle, and his feet shall stand in that day on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. Now, remember, when he went up into heaven, the angel said he will return here to the Mount of Olives. So here we are. What is to take place? A great battle in the Middle East. The Jews' existence being threatened. Anti-Semitism on a grand scale. The scriptures has got quite a lot of detail on that. Time's not with us probably to look at that. But it's said in Daniel chapter 11 verse 41. It's actually the king of the north, but Russia controls those territories today and is therefore very definitively, as we know from other quotes, the power of Russia confederate with Europe, shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, so Russia will enter in. Enter in and come to Jerusalem. But look how the verse, Daniel continues, and it says, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. When we look at those territories today, they are occupied by Western forces. And that describes Britain and America will oppose that thrust into Israel. But there will be chaos in the Middle East, utter chaos. It will be leading to World War III. And the only answer is Christ's intervention. His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof. That's what we've just read a moment ago. That's Zechariah chapter 14. That's the reversal of Acts chapter 1. Acts 1 said he will come again, and here it is. He'll return, and the Jews will be saved. Now, our quote, our reading, and maybe we should turn it up, Romans 11, is a very, very powerful statement and very wonderful. Romans 11, I'll pick up with verse 25 as we turn it up. For I would not, brethren, that you be ignorant of this mystery or secret, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. That blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles become in. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, now listen, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. What a wonderful thought. So what does it mean? Remember, Christ is going to return in the middle of that crisis. And what's he aiming to do? He's going to fulfill his covenant, and he's going to save that Jewish people. And how will it happen? What will reform them? They've never believed in Jesus Christ. They will then. We won't turn this up, but one will say unto him, what are these marks in your hands, Lord? Not knowing he's Jesus Christ. And he'll answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends in the Jewish nation. And they will know then that indeed he is the Lord Jesus Christ, the great Messiah. And what will be the response in the Jewish people? Zechariah says in another quote, yea, many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass, so the Jews will have reformed, and 10 men shall take hold out of all languages and nations, even take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with thee, for we have heard that God is with you. So you can see there will be a reformation. The 10 is the number of the nations, a symbolic number. So 10 men out of all nations will come. They'll affiliate with the Jew because they know that is the only way. Through that Jewish hope that was made to Abraham right at the beginning, that they have any hope of salvation. And the result will be, well, we may have Zechariah. No, we haven't got Zechariah 14 anymore, but it goes on to say, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one, and we know who that will be. It will be the great God of heaven manifest in his Son, who will rule that earth. Now, the burning question for us is, how long have we got? The answer is, we don't know. But we're given clues in Scripture. Look at this. Remember, Jesus said the Jews will be scattered into all nations and will not return till the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. In that same chapter, in that same prophecy, he goes on to say, and there shall be at that time upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. Now, I'd like to pick up that word perplexity for a minute. More modern versions translate it no way out. They are saying that the world will plunge into a chaotic situation where there's no easy answer. Nobody will know what to do. Does that sound like now? Well, just to take one or two little anti-Semitic moves that could be happening at the moment. Look at this. Saudi Arabia orders its citizens out of Lebanon immediately. Why? Because Lebanon is threatening Israel. Only 2 months ago, Israel did the largest military manoeuvre it made in 20 years because of our concern over what's happening in Lebanon. The Hezbollah, armed by Iran, is threatening with thousands of missiles to attack Israel. With missiles and invasion. So, the Saudis are saying, get out of Lebanon. Same with the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainians, the United Arab Emirates, saying, get out. And the king, who was in Saudi, determined not to go home because he feared he would be assassinated. Look at the date, only a few days ago. All right? And where does the world see this heading? Oh, they'll have an easy answer, wouldn't they? British paper, World War III fears over what's going on right now. Will it? I doubt it. Not yet. We know where it's the real World War III is going to be, Armageddon and Christ's return, which is still somewhat a little in the future. But we can see the gravity of what's happening. He feared assassination. They're worried about declaring war. 50k from the borders of Israel, Iran is now building a military base to threaten Israel. The scene is developing as we would expect, that the Middle East is going to be a centre of chaos. But let's return to Jesus' words. Yes, it will be a state of perplexity. Men's hearts failing them for fear. Look at that paper, World War III. That's how they fear it could end up. It's really looking very dangerous. But Jesus had further words. Look what he said. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. What's he saying? Well, when this situation develops where there really is no answer, you can't solve it, the thing looks like World War III and chaos, he said, that tells you my return is almost here. So you can see anti-Semitism are growing again in the land. Here, Iran, Russia, Lebanon, the Hezbollah threatening Israel. Sign of Christ's return. No way out. And when this begins to come to pass, it's not far away. So we're living in urgent times when we should be acting. It will come. Christ will return. And then a wonderful time will result on this earth. Then all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Moses was told way back in Numbers. Numbers chapter 14, verse 21. Let's not turn it up. They're our concluding words. It will come. The Bible is sure. It is certain. And Christ's return is almost here. Thank you.